you're going to need a bigger bar than you think. On this mill, I've got a 28-inch bar with the mill adjusted all the way over to the chainsaw so it's touching. And on this side with the mill adjusted as close as I can get out to the sprocket without going over it, I can just cut a 20-inch wide plank. The actual distance between the two inside edges of the mill is about 21 3/8 inches. That gives you just a little bit of space to work the saw down the plank, or to work the saw down the tree. So figure around 4 inches on each end of loss per clamp on your chainsaw mill. So if you've got a double clamp mill like this, you're going to lose about 8 inches. Cleaning up the log. On the larger trees I've been milling, I've been cutting the sides off the tree so that the log is only 20 inches wide. This is about as wide as my current setup will cut a slab, and this results in the guides sliding easily. On smaller logs where I've not needed to square up the log, or on top cuts, the live edges and places where branches come out of the tree can also cause problems for the guides. It's really important to clean up the sides of the log so that there's nothing for the guides to get stuck on. The wedge-shaped sides of a top cut or live edge can result in binding if the guides ride on them. Any place where branches come out can easily cause the guides to get stuck. Having a few inches of play on either side of the slab can help keep the saw moving smoothly, and I find shifting the angle slightly as I'm moving down the cut helps keep things from slowing down. Saw size. I've been using a 70cc class saw with a 28-inch bar that gives me a maximum cut width of 20 inches. Cutting 16 to 20-inch spruce planks with this setup is somewhat slow. Cutting smaller spruce boards with a 24-inch bar on this saw making 8 to 12-inch planks was much quicker and just felt more satisfying, like I was being more productive. For cutting 20+ inch slabs, I'd really much rather be using a 90 to 120cc saw with a 36-inch bar. Chains can dull quickly. Bark and dirt can dull chains quickly. Try saying that 3 times fast. For optimum performance, you can debark the logs before milling. This can extend the time between sharpening. Also, keep the saw chain away from the ground. Just a quick bump of the chain into the soil can take the edge off and result in noticeably slower cuts. I don't really have the patience for debarking. Another option is to square your logs off so that you only interact with the bark on the first top cut and the 2 side cuts. This will give you more uniform boards at the expense of some width on the boards near the center of the log. For me, it seems that I only really get the full performance of a sharp chain for about 2 or 3 cuts before things get noticeably slower. Granted, these are 13-foot long and 20-inch wide cuts. Some of the YouTubers I've watched say that they like to touch up the chain every few slabs, but I find the sound of files makes my skin crawl. For that reason, I plan to keep a selection of chains on hand and use an electric chain sharpener between milling sessions. Air filters. Milling produces a lot of finer sawdust particles, and with the way mills tend to be set up, those sawdust particles are getting sprayed right into the saw's intake. So clean the air filter often and keep a few spares on hand. If you find your saw is not performing right, check your air filter. Ladders and rails. The quick rail systems seem alright for smaller diameter logs, but the lack of rigidity and their narrow width seems less suited to larger, wider logs. Aluminum ladders, with their tall legs and wider profiles, provide much better vertical rigidity and support the weight of the saw better. The width is really nice on longer, slower cuts. The extra rigidity of the ladders means there is less of a need to support the rails mid-span, and the rungs in the ladder provide more opportunity to support the ladder if needed. Supporting the saw, the length of the ladder ultimately limits the length of the board you can cut. There are a few YouTubers out there that have systems for extending this, but for the most part, the ladder's length is the practical limit of the cut. It's tempting to short yourself setup space at the start of the cut, but I find that I really like having a foot or so of ladder hanging off the starting end of the log so that I can have the saw weight supported and the chain lined up to the log at the start of the cut. To save some of that space, you can start the cut at an angle as long as you have the cross support between the 2 rails of the mill aligned so that you can use it as a support when starting. The goal is to keep the saw at a consistent angle and pressure through the cut. Wedges and wide planks. Wedges were something I saw used heavily in the chainsaw videos I watched, and it makes sense. You don't want the weight of the slab pinching the saw. On the larger logs, the cut just stayed open, and I found it pretty much unnecessary. I simply forgot to use them until the end of the cut. It was only when I started working on smaller diameter logs that I found I needed to use wedges, especially when doing bottom cuts, which is something I really only did with smaller logs. Bottom cuts. On large logs, getting the first cut sorted out was pretty simple. I could cut a nice thick top plank off that allowed my saw to fully clear the ladder supports. Once the top cut was made, I adjusted my saw down to the 1 or 2 inch thickness of the planks I wanted. Then I would flip the first slab over and cut planks out of the top piece, then mill the rest of the log up. This just didn't work on smaller logs. By the time I cleared the support, I'd almost be in the middle of the log. In these cases, I would do a bottom cut. I would adjust the mill out to cut the first slab off the bottom, making the bottom slab as thin as possible, then roll it over, set my thickness, and mill up the rest of the log. Don't push. The saw should only need a gentle pressure, if any, to keep the saw engaged with the cut. If you're pushing, then there's probably something wrong, and you're much more likely to damage your saw and ruin your slab. Bar wear. Bar wear is something I didn't really appreciate when I first started milling. I figured that the chainsaw mill would keep the boards a consistent thickness and the bar and chain would just cut away. Unfortunately, chains can wear the bar unevenly, especially when pushing, and I found that on my mill setup, the upper side of the bar wore down faster than the bottom. You can also wear out the groove in the bar, making it easier for the chain to go at an angle. The wear, presumably from all my pushing, resulted in the saw lifting out of the log. No matter how hard I tried to pin the saw to the log, or angle the saw down to stay in the cut, the saw would lift up out of the log, ruining the slab. At first I thought this was an issue of how the mill was clamped on the bar, or the mill was not true. I spent a lot of time fiddling with the mill, trying to make sure it was right, but no amount of adjustment or new sharp chains could keep the mill cutting straight. It was only resolved when I replaced the bar. Lastly, you're going to want some protection for your ears and your lungs. Breathing in the sawdust and the chainsaw exhaust really takes a toll on you if you're running the saw for a long time. I found that after running the saw for a day or two, my throat was pretty sore. So I got out my welding respirator. It helped, but I could still taste a sweetness through this. And I kind of suspect that's because the clone saw I'm running uses 25-to-1 on its oil instead of 40 or 50-to-1. And if you're going to be running a saw on a mill for any significant amount of time on a regular basis, I'd seriously recommend looking into the name brand saws like from Husqvarna and Stihl and Echo. They're going to be compliant with newer EPA regulations, and the exhausts on those are going to run a lot cleaner. So what items on this list can help you not blow up your saw? Keep your air filter clean, keep your chain sharp, and don't push. Keep your air filter clean and your chain sharp, and don't go pushing on